Let me ask you something. Have you ever sat across from a financial advisor or read something online or watched a YouTube video and heard someone say, just use the 4% rule, you'll be fine? If you have, I'm glad you're here today because whoever told you that wasn't lying to you, exactly. But they were handing you a tool without explaining what it was actually built for. And when you use a tool for the wrong job, things can go wrong in ways that don't show up until it's too late to fix them. I'm Melanie Kent. I specialize in Social Security and retirement income planning. And today we're going to take the 4% rule apart, where it came from, what it was actually designed to do, where it genuinely works, and what you should use instead when it doesn't fit your situation. By the end of this, you'll have a much more honest picture of how to think about what your savings can actually produce in retirement. Let's get into it. In October 1994, a financial planner named William Bengen published a paper in the Journal of Financial Planning. He'd been working with baby boomer clients who kept asking him the same question: how much can I actually spend in retirement without running out of money? Nobody had a good answer. So Bengen went back through decades of historical market data, all the way to 1926, and ran the numbers for every possible 30-year retirement window he could find. He was looking for the absolute worst case, the most brutal starting point, the worst market timing, the worst sequence of returns imaginable. He landed on 1968, someone who retired right at a market peak and then watched inflation and a recession grind through the entire 1970s. In that worst-case scenario, a retiree who withdrew 4% of their initial portfolio in year one and then adjusted that dollar amount for inflation every year after still had money left after 30 years. The actual number Bengen calculated was 4.15%, but it got rounded down when the paper was published, and the round number stuck. Now here's something Bengen himself has said clearly, multiple times in recent years. That number was never meant to be the default setting for every retiree. He described it as a worst-case floor, the minimum you could withdraw even under the most brutal historical conditions and still survive 30 years. The average safe withdrawal rate over the last 100 years, by his own calculations, is closer to 7%. Most retirees throughout history could have withdrawn significantly more than 4% and been perfectly fine. But somewhere along the way, the floor became the ceiling. The worst-case scenario became the standard advice. And now millions of people are using a number that was designed for one very specific purpose, as if it applies universally to every retirement situation. It doesn't. So let's talk about where it actually breaks down, because there are a few distinct problems and they affect different people in different ways. The first one is the timeline, and this one doesn't get nearly enough attention. Bengen's research was built around a 30-year retirement. That's it, 30 years. So if you retire at 65, the 4% rule was designed to carry you to roughly 95. That's fine. But what if you retire at 62? Now you potentially need 33, 35, maybe 38 years of income from that portfolio. The math was never stress-tested for that. In 1994, planning for a 38-year retirement just wasn't the conversation people were having. Morningstar, which publishes updated retirement income research every year based on current market conditions and forward-looking return projections, currently puts the safe starting withdrawal rate for a 30-year retirement at 3.9%. That's their 2025 figure. For a longer horizon, it goes lower. And that 3.9% is already a revision. In 2021, when bond yields were near zero and stock valuations were stretched, Morningstar dropped their recommendation all the way to 3.3%. The following years brought it back up as conditions shifted. The point being, there's no permanent answer here. The right number moves with market conditions, and the 4% figure was set in 1994 with a completely different market environment behind it. Bengen's original research assumed no income other than portfolio withdrawals. He was modeling pure portfolio depletion. What rate keeps the money alive when the portfolio is doing all the work? But most retirees have Social Security coming. Some have pensions. When you have guaranteed income already covering part of your monthly expenses, your portfolio doesn't have to carry the full load. The withdrawal rate question becomes entirely different. Say you need $5,000 a month and Social Security covers $2,200 of that. Your portfolio only needs to generate $2,800. On a $700,000 portfolio, that's a 4.8% withdrawal rate on paper, which sounds aggressive if you're applying the 4% rule to the full number. But it's actually quite manageable when inflation-adjusted guaranteed income is handling nearly half your expenses. Applying the 4% rule to your total expense number, without accounting for what Social Security is already covering, will make you think you need hundreds of thousands more than you actually do. That's the blind spot. The third issue is one I find people immediately recognize because it matches how they actually live. The 4% rule assumes you spend the same amount every year. The first year dollar amount, adjusted for inflation, repeated identically for 30 years. Real retirement spending doesn't work that way. It tends to look more like a smile. Higher in the early active years when you're traveling and doing things you've been putting off for decades, lower in the middle stretch when life naturally slows. Then, potentially higher again later if healthcare or long-term care costs start climbing. A rule that locks you into identical spending every year doesn't match that pattern. You end up either withdrawing too much in the lower spending middle years or holding yourself back in the early years when you actually have the energy and health to use the money. Drop a comment below on this one. Do you picture your spending being roughly the same at 66 as it would be at 80? Because in my experience, almost nobody actually believes that. Yet almost every standard withdrawal plan is built as if they do. Let me bring in Diane here because I think her situation makes all of this concrete. Diane is 64. She has $820,000 in her 401k. She's been told, more than once, that 4% in retirement means about $32,800 a year, roughly $2,730 a month. She's been building her entire retirement picture around that number and feeling reasonably good about it. Her full situation. Social Security at 67 will bring in about $2,150 a month. Her actual expenses, she went back and checked her real 24-month average, come out to $4,900 a month, including healthcare. Watch what happens when you run this properly. Diane retires now at 64. For the 3 years before Social Security kicks in, she's covering $4,900 a month entirely from her portfolio. That's about $58,800 a year from an $820,000 account, roughly a 7.2% withdrawal rate in those early years. That's not sustainable long term. But once Social Security starts at 67, the math shifts completely. Now her portfolio only needs to cover the gap. $4,900 minus $2,150, which is $2,750 a month, about $33,000 a year. On whatever her portfolio has grown or shrunk to by then, that's in the neighborhood of 4% or just under. Suddenly, the picture is a lot healthier. So Diane isn't in a dangerous situation, but the way she'd been thinking about it, $32,800 a year, straightforward 4%, done, completely glossed over those 3 bridge years where she'd be drawing at nearly double that rate before Social Security steps in. A better version of her plan has her being more conservative with spending for those 3 years, letting Social Security start at 67 at the higher amount, and then letting that guaranteed income carry much more of the monthly weight for the rest of retirement. That's a fundamentally different plan, and it's built from her actual numbers instead of a generic rule.
So if not a rigid 4%,
What should you actually use? Honestly, I'd replace the number with a framework. 3 pieces. Start with your income floor. What's the guaranteed monthly income that doesn't depend on the market? Social Security, pension, anything like that. Figure that out first. Whatever your total monthly need is, minus that floor, is the gap your savings actually have to cover. And that's the only number that matters for the withdrawal rate question. Then be honest about your time horizon. If you're retiring at 62 or 63, you're planning for potentially 35 years. Morningstar's current research says 3.9% for 30 years with a 90% success rate, and that goes lower for longer horizons. Build from that reality, not from a 1994 paper that assumed a 65-year-old with no other income. And build in flexibility. There's a spending approach called the guardrails method, developed by financial planners Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger, which shows that if you're willing to spend a little less when the market is down and a little more when it's up, you can start at a meaningfully higher withdrawal rate than if you demand the exact same dollar amount regardless of what's happening around you. If you want a full breakdown of how the guardrails approach actually works in practice, let me know in the comments. If enough of you want it, that's next. And if this kind of analysis is what you're looking for, where we actually check the numbers before we repeat them, subscribe and hit the bell. This is what we do here every week. The 4% rule isn't worthless. It was a genuinely important piece of research that gave retirees a starting framework when they didn't have one. But it was built in 1994 for a 30-year horizon, using historical returns that may or may not reflect what's ahead, and with no Social Security or pension in the picture. Use it as a rough reference point. Just don't use it as a retirement plan. Your plan needs to start with your income, your real expenses, and your actual time horizon. Once you have those 3 things nailed down, the right withdrawal strategy becomes a lot less intimidating. Tomorrow, we're getting into the 7 situations where filing for Social Security at 62 is genuinely the right call. Not the easy call, the right one. That conversation tends to get heated, so come ready to think. See you then.